Sloane Davenport wasn't supposed to see her ex-husband that night. She was supposed to stand in a Chelsea gallery surrounded by 200 strangers and prove that 3 years of being broken apart, piece by piece, hadn't destroyed her. She was 27 years old, with $3,400 in her bank account, a scar across her right knuckle from the night he'd grabbed her wrist and twisted until something cracked, and a comeback exhibition that represented every hour she'd spent rebuilding herself from the wreckage of a marriage to a man who smiled at charity dinners and shattered things when the doors were closed. Dmitry Kessler, half Russian, half American, all sharp cheekbones and tailored navy suits, and the kind of handsome that's specifically engineered to make people trust you, walked into that gallery 47 minutes before opening with the confidence of a man who believed he still owned every room she stood in. He wasn't invited. He didn't need to be. He moved through the crowd the way he'd always moved through her life, slowly, deliberately, letting her see him coming so the fear would arrive before he did. And when he finally reached her, he didn't threaten her in English. He pulled out his phone, pretended to take a call, and started speaking rapid, low Russian right next to her ear, close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough that his shoulder blocked her view of every exit. She caught pieces her best friend's name, an address in Queens, the Russian word for accident, and a phrase at the end delivered so quietly it barely qualified as sound. If she doesn't sign, take care of it. He hung up, smiled at her like nothing had happened, and said, "I'm proud of you, sweetheart." But here's what Sloane didn't know. There was a man standing 10 steps behind Dmitry who'd heard every single word of that phone call, every syllable, every threat, every name. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he was there. And she definitely didn't know that what he was about to do next, in front of 200 people, under gallery lights, with a glass of wine still in his hand, would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. If this story's already got you locked in, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs a good story tonight. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that gallery, because the stranger just stepped up to the microphone, and nobody in that room is ready for what he's about to say. The strange man set his glass of wine down on the edge of the small podium the gallery owner had used to give the opening remarks 20 minutes earlier, then tapped the microphone twice with the tip of his finger. A dry, neat sound that made 200 people in the room turn their heads at the same time, as if someone had just flipped a switch. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask permission. He didn't smile with the polite social grace wealthy people often display when they want to be liked. He simply stood there, both hands resting on the edge of the podium, and spoke in a voice that didn't need to be loud, because it had been built to make people fall silent and listen. "I want to buy all 6 works in tonight's exhibition. Full listed price. No negotiation. $900,000. 6 words and $900,000. The gallery broke into murmurs like a hive of bees someone had struck with a stick. Heads turning, whispers spreading. A few people laughing because they thought it was a joke, until they looked at his face and understood that this was the kind of man who didn't joke about anything. Sloane stood 7 steps from the podium, feeling the hardwood floor beneath her heels as if it were tilting slightly to one side. And she didn't know what she was feeling, because there was no emotion in any dictionary she owned for the situation in which a complete stranger had just bought out the only comeback exhibition she had, with more money than everything she had ever earned put together. But he wasn't finished. He stepped down from the podium, unhurried, moving through the crowd with a kind of energy Sloane could only describe as gravity. People stepped aside for him, not because he asked them to, but because their bodies decided on their own that it was the thing to do, and he walked straight to where Dmitry Kessler was standing beside the 3rd painting, with a glass of red wine frozen halfway to his mouth. He stopped less than 1 step from Dmitry. Then he spoke in Russian, slowly, each word dropping like a stone thrown into still water, loud enough for the 15 to 20 people standing closest to hear every syllable clearly, even though none of them understood its meaning. Sloane was close enough to hear his voice, but her Russian was only broken pieces she had picked up from 3 years of listening to Dmitry speak on the phone with his mother's family, and she caught only 3 things: the word recording, her name, and the final phrase, which she understood as clearly as if he had spoken in English. "She isn't your problem anymore." She didn't need to understand the rest. She only needed to look at Dmitry's face. 3 years of marriage had taught Sloane to read that face the way one reads a weather map in the mountains, and she had seen every expression it was capable of making: anger, contempt, Charm calculated down to the millimeter. Cruelty practiced until it became elegant. She had never seen it look like this. The blood drained from Dmitri Kessler's face, in the most literal sense, from forehead to chin, as if someone had pulled a white curtain over his skin. And his eyes, the eyes she had once thought were beautiful, the eyes she had once looked into and believed she was loved, those eyes now held something she had never seen in Dmitri Kessler throughout the past 3 years. Pure, raw, undiluted fear. Dmitri set his wineglass down on the nearest table, the only movement that still carried a trace of control, then turned his back and walked toward the gallery door at a speed faster than a normal walk, but not fast enough to be called running. And he didn't look back, didn't look at her, didn't look at anyone, just went straight out through the glass door and vanished into the Manhattan night. 200 people stood in the room without understanding a single Russian word that had just been spoken. But everyone within a radius of 5 meters saw it. A man who looked as if he owned the world had just been told a few sentences by another man and had responded by fleeing. The stranger turned away toward the side door on the left of the gallery. Sloane moved before she had time to decide to move, her feet carrying her to the side door faster than him because she was smaller, and the crowd made way for her by the sheer inertia of a night that had lost all order, and she stood blocking the exit, looking straight up into his face for the first time at a distance, close enough to see the faint scar along his left temple, and the asymmetrical lines of a face that had lived through things most people only read about. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at her, and Sloane felt the weight of that gaze, not invasive, but complete, the kind of look from a person assessing something he hadn't yet decided had value or not. "The man who just bought your paintings," he said. Then he stepped around her, without touching her, without stopping, without leaving a business card, without leaving a phone number, without leaving a promise of protection or an explanation, or anything Sloane could hold in her hand and look at 3 o'clock in the morning when she couldn't sleep, and he passed through the side door into the alley beside the gallery and disappeared. Sloane stood there for another 10 seconds. Then she turned back inside, found the gallery owner, asked for the guest list, and read every name from beginning to end. The name Cassius Rinaldi wasn't on the list. He hadn't been invited. Just like Dmitri. 2 men had walked into the most important night of her life without anyone inviting them, one coming to destroy it, and one coming for a reason she didn't yet know, and she stood in the gallery as it slowly emptied around her, with $900,000 just promised for her 6 paintings, and no way of knowing whether it was the best or worst thing that had ever happened to her. Sloane got back to her studio in Bushwick at nearly 11 o'clock at night, climbed 4 flights of stairs in a building with no elevator on legs she couldn't entirely feel, because the lower half of her body was still running on adrenaline while the upper half had already begun shutting down like one light after another in an empty building. She locked the door, slid the bolt into place, checked the kitchen window, the bedroom window, the small bathroom window she had covered with another layer of frosted film 3 months earlier, because the apartment across the way looked straight in, and every motion was an automatic reflex trained through 3 years of marriage, then sharpened over the 10 months since she left, the thing she used to call paranoia, until a therapist she could only afford to see 3 times told her it wasn't paranoia. It was survival arithmetic, and she should stop being ashamed of it. She sat on the bed, took off her shoes, placed both hands on her thighs, and looked down. Her hands weren't shaking. She lifted her right hand in front of her face, spread her fingers, studied the scar on her knuckle in the yellow light of the only desk lamp in the studio, and waited for the familiar tremor to come. It didn't. For the past 10 months, every time Dmitri appeared, even if only through a message from his lawyer, her hands shook, a tiny vibration at the tips of her fingers that she hid by clenching her fists or shoving her hands into her coat pockets or holding a coffee cup with both hands, and she had grown so used to living with that tremor that it had become the background rhythm of her body, like the sound of an air conditioner in a room that you only notice when it stops. Now it had stopped, and the absence of it frightened her more than Dmitri Kessler himself, because it meant something inside her had changed without her permission, and Sloane Davenport had learned through bone and blood that things changing inside her without her control were usually the beginning of trouble. 48 hours later, she was sitting on the kitchen floor, eating a bowl of instant noodles at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because she had forgotten breakfast, and there was nothing else in the refrigerator, when her phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. She opened the app. Account balance: $891,000. She read the number 3 times. She set the bowl of noodles down on the floor. She read it a fourth time. 900,000 minus the gallery's 10% commission equaled 891,000. The math was right. The money was real, sitting in an account that 3 days earlier had held $3,400, and now held a number she had never seen on anything that belonged to her. She called Darcy. Darcy Webb answered from the emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital in Queens during a 12-hour shift, with the voice of someone accustomed to handling crisis through speed and clarity instead of emotion, and Sloane told her everything from beginning to end without stopping, because if she stopped, she would start analyzing, and if she started analyzing, she wouldn't be able to tell the whole story. When Darcy finished listening, she was silent for exactly 3 seconds, then asked 4 questions, in the order only an emergency nurse used to triaging patients would ask them. Did he touch you? No. Are you hurt? No. Has Dimitri contacted you again since then? Not yet. Do you know who that man really is? No. And that's the problem. Darcy said she would come over after her shift. And she really did. At 11 o'clock that night, carrying Thai food, a cheap bottle of wine, and the steady presence of the friend who had told Sloane plainly that Dimitri was an abuser 2 years before Sloane was ready to hear it. And she said, "You don't know what he wants, but I know nobody gives away $900,000 for nothing. Keep the money, keep the doors locked, and wait to see what he asks for." For the next 3 days, Sloane worked in the studio, trying to focus on a small restoration contract for a private collector in Midtown that she was finishing so she could pay next month's rent, except now she didn't need next month's rent anymore, and that fact kept distracting her every 15 minutes. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 3rd day, there was a knock at the studio door. Not the kind of knock made by a delivery person or a neighbor, but the kind that came only twice and then waited. The knock of someone who knew 2 times were enough. She looked through the peephole. The man standing outside was built like a granite wall, dark-skinned, with cropped hair, wearing an ordinary gray suit, but carrying the kind of stance Sloane had learned to recognize in 3 years beside Dimitri, the stance of a person used to assessing a room before entering it, so he would know every exit and every threat. She opened the door, but not all the way, only wide enough to see his face, and to let him see that she hadn't opened it all the way. He said exactly 1 sentence. "I have something to deliver to Miss." Davenport then held out a black envelope with no logo, no sender's name, the paper thick and heavy in her hand in a way cheap envelopes never were. She asked who he was. He said, "Sawyer." No last name, no title, only 1 word spoken with the economy of a man who considered every extra syllable a waste of energy. Then he turned and went back down the stairs, not waiting for her to open the envelope, not waiting for a response. Sloane closed the door, locked it again, stood at the kitchen table, and opened the envelope. There were 2 things inside. The first was a professional photograph of an oil painting, a portrait of a woman in a winter fur cloak, warm golden light on her skin, a dark background, the style of 19th century Russia, which Sloane recognized instantly because she had spent 5 years of her career studying exactly that period. The second was a handwritten note, the handwriting hard and slanted, 6 words and 2 letters. "Needs authentication. 2 weeks. Address on back. Signed, C.R." She turned the note over. An address in Tribeca. She looked back at the photograph, and something in her stomach tightened because she knew this painting. Not knew it in the way of having seen it before, but knew it in the way of having read about it on the list of missing artworks maintained by the Commission for the Protection of Artistic Heritage, a database whose most important works every serious appraiser knew by heart. Portrait of a lady in winter, missing since 1945, believed to have been destroyed or to have disappeared into the black market after the Second World War. If the painting in this photograph was real, it was worth between $25 and $30 million. If it was a copy, someone was trying to sell a $30 million fake. Both possibilities meant Sloane Davenport had just been invited to step into a room where she didn't know who was standing inside, didn't know how many doors there were, and didn't know which one led out. Sloane arrived at the address in Tribeca on a Thursday afternoon, 20 minutes early for the appointment, because she had learned long ago that arriving early in unfamiliar places told her things that arriving on time never would. And the first thing this place told her was that someone had deliberately wanted it to look like nothing worth looking at. From the outside, the building was a typical industrial warehouse from old Tribeca. the kind of building pedestrians passed without turning their heads. Dirty gray brick walls, a rusted metal roll-up door, a street number so small she had to stop and look twice to make sure she was in the right place. And no sign of any kind suggesting that anything inside might be worth more than concrete and dust. She pressed the doorbell to the left of the roll-up door. No one answered through an intercom. The door simply opened, automatically, silently, and that meant someone was watching her through a camera she couldn't see, something she added to the list of things to remember about this place. She stepped inside and stopped. The interior wasn't an abandoned warehouse. It was a vast open space with ceilings at least 6 meters high, raw concrete walls left exposed and unpainted, polished concrete floors reflecting the light from a row of industrial lamps suspended from a metal track system running the length of the ceiling. And everything in this space spoke the same language. A great deal of money spent by someone who didn't want anyone to know it had been spent. The painting hung on the wall opposite the entrance. Sloane saw it, and everything else in the room ceased to exist for about 3 seconds, because she was an appraiser before she was anything else. And the painting was being lit by museum-grade specialized lighting, the kind of lighting whose exact price she knew because she had recommended it to clients before. And beneath that light, Portrait of a Lady in Winter was no longer the photograph from the black envelope, but a living presence, the oil paint catching the light in a way no copy could reproduce from any angle. And Sloane Davenport's professional heart began to beat faster, because her eyes were telling her that the thing on that wall had a very high chance of being real. Then she saw him. Cassius Rinaldi was sitting at a metal table in the right corner of the space. Black shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, no suit jacket, no tie, reading a thick file, and he didn't look up when she came in, though she knew he had been watching her on camera before she ever pressed the bell. He didn't stand, didn't greet her, didn't smile with the polite manner wealthy men often use when meeting women for the first time to give the impression that they're decent. He simply closed the file, looked up, and spoke in the flat voice of someone giving instructions rather than beginning a conversation. The painting is on the wall. The equipment you need is on the table to the right. I need a conclusion in 2 weeks. The table to the right held everything a professional appraiser needed. A handheld UV lamp, an illuminated magnifying glass, a paint sampling kit, a tablet already connected to 3 art databases Sloane regularly used, and every piece of equipment was the best version money could buy, which meant someone had researched exactly what she would need before she arrived, and that preparation was both professional and slightly cold, because it implied she had been studied more closely than she wanted. Sloane didn't touch the equipment, didn't step toward the painting. She stayed where she was, 4 steps from his metal table, and said, "Before I touch anything, I need 3 answers. Who you are, where the painting came from, and why you chose me." He looked at her. This was the second time Sloane had received that look, the one she had first felt at the gallery's side door. Complete, unhurried, not invasive, but extremely thorough. And this time, at a closer distance beneath the white industrial light, she could see more clearly. The lean line of his jawbone, the scar at his left temple running up into his hairline, the creases around the eyes of a man who slept little, not because of insomnia, but because there were too many things to manage during the hours ordinary people used for sleep. "Cassius Rinaldi," he said, "private collection from Eastern Europe. And I chose you because you're the best in this field whose loyalty I haven't bought." The last sentence struck Sloane in a way she hadn't not because it was rude, but because it was honest in a way most people were never honest. And that honesty told her 2 things. 1, he had bought the loyalty of other appraisers, which meant he operated at a level where loyalty was something that could be purchased. And 2, he had chosen her precisely because she didn't belong to that system, because he needed an answer no one he had bought could give. She waited for him to mention the night at the gallery, to mention Dmitri, to mention the $900,000, to mention the phone call in Russian. He mentioned none of it. Not one word connected this meeting to that night, as if the 2 events existed in 2 parallel universes, and he had no intention of allowing them to cross, and that separation was so deliberate that it became a kind of message all by itself. This was a business transaction, not salvation, not kindness, not a promise of protection. Just a man with a painting that needed authentication and a woman with the skill to do it. And everything beyond that scope did not exist in this room. Sloane didn't know whether that made her feel relieved or more uneasy, and she decided both feelings could be true at the same time. "I'll need access to whatever provenance records you have, if you have any," she said, and her voice had shifted into her working voice, the voice in which every personal feeling was placed into a box and stored on a high shelf until the work was done, and that was the only language she fully trusted. "There are no provenance records," he said, and that sentence alone was a red flag any appraiser would recognize, because a work worth tens of millions of dollars without papers proving its origin meant it had come from a place where paperwork couldn't follow. She accepted the contract, not because she trusted him, she didn't trust anyone, but because she was an appraiser, and the painting on that wall was asking her a question she couldn't walk away from without answering. She set clear boundaries in her mind before touching the first piece of equipment. Come to the warehouse to work during daylight. Return to the Brooklyn studio every evening. Never stay after dark. No dinners. No conversations outside the scope of work. Don't give him her studio address, even though she suspected he already knew it. Boundaries. The wall she built for herself. The only thing keeping her separate from the world of men with too much power and too few reasons to explain how they used it. 2 weeks turned the Tribeca warehouse into Sloane's world in the way only work could, because work was the only place where she didn't have to pretend she was fine or not fine, or processing or healing, or in any other state people expected from a 27-year-old woman who had just escaped 3 years of an abusive marriage and was in the middle of a divorce. Here, she only had to be the eyes and the hands, and the trained mind that could read the surface of oil paint the way other people read books. She worked methodically, beginning at the upper left corner of the painting, and moving downward through a grid she drew inside her head, each square examined under ultraviolet light to search for signs of repair or overpainting. Then, through an illuminated magnifying lens to read the structure of the brushwork at a level the naked eye couldn't reach. Then cross-checked against the stylistic database of painters from the same period on the tablet, and every step confirmed the same conclusion that was slowly becoming impossible to deny. The painting was real. The oil paint had natural age cracking of the correct period, the kind of cracking no artificial aging technology could perfectly reproduce, because it required 80 years of real time to form. The pigments matched what had been available in 19th century Russia. The brushwork carried the mark of a personal technique she recognized from 2 other works by the same artist that she had studied in her master's thesis. Portrait of a Lady in Winter was authentic, and that alone was enough to make any appraiser sit down and breathe deeply, because she was touching something the art world had believed destroyed for more than 80 years. But the real discovery came on the 9th day, when she removed the frame to examine the back of the canvas. Beneath the frame lining, where only someone who took the frame apart would see it, there was a line of numbers handwritten in black ink on the original canvas. The ink had browned with time, the particular browning of iron ink common in the middle of the 20th century, and the sequence consisted of 12 characters in a format Sloane recognized immediately, because she had encountered it 3 times in her career, while appraising works with disputed World War II origins. It was a Swiss bank account code, the kind of anonymous account opened in the 1940s. The kind of account people used to hide what they didn't want, governments or armies or anyone else to know about, and someone had written this code on the back of the painting because the painting itself was the lock. Whoever owned the painting saw the number and understood it had the right to access the account. 80 years of money sitting in a Swiss bank, gathering interest, waiting for someone to read the sequence on the back. Sloane photographed the string of numbers with her personal phone, not with the tablet Cassius had provided because she didn't know who might have access to the data on it. Then she put the frame back exactly as it had been, and told no one. Not Cassius, not Darcy, not Ruth. She kept the secret because her professional instinct told her information was the only thing of real value in any situation, and she needed to understand what she was holding before deciding whether anyone else should know she was holding it. Alongside that discovery, Sloane gradually began to notice another pattern inside the warehouse that she hadn't expected. Cassius Rinaldi came to the warehouse 3 to 4 times a week, sat at the metal table doing his own work, reading files, taking phone calls in a low voice in Italian or English, sometimes meeting with people whose footsteps and the sound of a closed private room door were all she ever heard, though she never saw their faces. He didn't ask about her progress, didn't stand behind her watching her work, didn't offer opinions or suggestions or any form of interference Sloane had grown used to receiving from other clients, and especially from Dmitri, who always had an opinion about everything she did even though he knew nothing about art restoration. Cassius let her work, but he watched. She realized this on the 5th day, while she was using ultraviolet light to examine the lower right corner of the painting, and caught his reflection in the protective glass. He was watching her from the metal table, not directly, but from the corner of his eye, the kind of observation practiced by a person used to watching without wanting to be caught watching. Then, 3 days later, while pouring himself water, he asked her a question. "You use different ultraviolet frequencies for the oil layer and the varnish layer, don't you? I saw you switch the filter twice at the right corner." That question told her he had remembered exactly what she did, in which position, on which day, a level of attention she wasn't sure whether to call respect or surveillance. Then, on the afternoon of the 11th day, close to 8 o'clock at night, Sloane was still working because she had lost all sense of time, the thing that always happened when she sank into the surface of oil paint beneath a magnifying lens, and she didn't realize she was hungry until a box of Italian food appeared on the table beside her elbow. No invitation, no question, no sound of footsteps approaching, because he moved so quietly she didn't hear him. Just a warm white paper box placed beside her before he returned to his own table. And Sloane ate without stopping her work because that was how she always ate, standing or sitting in front of a work table, one hand holding a tool and the other holding a spoon, swallowing almost without chewing because meals, to her, weren't rituals but fuel hurriedly loaded between stretches of work. 20 minutes later, Cassius's voice came from the metal table, his eyes not lifting from the file. "You eat like someone used to being forgotten at mealtimes." Sloane's hand stopped halfway through the motion. She set the spoon down. That sentence wasn't an observation. It was a diagnosis, so precise it pierced a layer of protection she hadn't even known she was wearing. Dimitri had controlled her meals for 3 years, not by refusing to let her eat, but by managing everything around eating. When she ate, what she ate, how much she ate, commenting on her weight in a voice that sounded like concern, but was really a bridle, and when she left, she thought she had escaped it, but in truth she had only turned it into a new habit, forgetting to eat, eating quickly, eating standing up, eating alone in the dark as if a meal were something she needed permission to have, and when there was no one to grant permission, she simply forgot she needed it at all. She said nothing to Cassius. She didn't explain. She picked up the spoon and kept eating, but this time she ate more slowly, and she realized she was eating more slowly. And that realization hurt in the quiet way only very old wounds hurt, the kind of pain that belongs to something you don't know you're still carrying until someone accidentally touches it. From that day on, every evening she worked late. Food appeared at 7 o'clock. No invitation, no question, just there. It happened on the afternoon of the 12th day, 2 days before the end of the 2-week deadline, while Sloane was at the work table writing notes about the protective varnish layer on the surface of the canvas, and Cassius stepped into the closed room at the back of the warehouse to take a call, as he often did. Except this time he didn't close the door all the way. The door remained open by a hand's width, enough for his voice to escape through the gap and travel straight to where Sloane sat less than 4 meters away. And he was speaking Italian, fast and low, in a voice she had heard enough times over the past 2 weeks to recognize as the voice he used when giving orders, not when having a discussion. And her Italian was only a few broken pieces from 2 college semesters, but it was enough for her to catch the phrase in the middle of the sentence because he said it more slowly than the rest, as if emphasizing it to the person on the other end of the line. Lei è uno strumento, niente di più. She is a tool, nothing more. Sloane's pen stopped, not the way a hand stops from fatigue or slips by accident, but the way an entire body freezes for the length of time the brain needs to process what the ears have just received and confirm that she had heard correctly, that she hadn't mistranslated, that the man who placed food beside her elbow every evening at 7 o'clock, the man whose painfully precise comment had said she ate like someone used to being forgotten at mealtimes, that man had just called her a tool to someone over the phone, in a language he thought she didn't understand. And what rose inside her wasn't fear. 3 years with Dimitri had given her a rich dictionary of fear. She knew what fear looked like, what it felt like in the stomach, the taste it left in her mouth when she swallowed it down at 3 o'clock in the morning. And what was rising inside her now wasn't fear. It was anger, the anger that 3 years of marriage had taught her to shove into a box, lock away, push down to the bottom of her belly, and leave there to rot, because Dimitri had taught her through consequences that her anger was dangerous, that every time she was angry, it was proof she was emotionally unstable, that anger in a woman was a symptom to be treated, rather than a reasonable response to being handled like an object. She had swallowed her anger long enough. She had sworn to herself in that studio in Bushwick, sitting on the floor with divorce papers in her hands, that she would never again let anyone at all, use her as a tool, and she had just heard that oath violated by the person she had begun. In some deep corner of awareness she didn't want to admit existed, to let herself trust. But Sloane Davenport wasn't the kind of person who confronted through emotion. She had survived 3 years with Dmitri Kessler, not because she was good at enduring pain, but because she was good at waiting, good at gathering information, good at keeping her face flat while she was planning inside. She set the pen down on the table. She breathed in once, twice, then she turned back to the painting, picked up the UV lamp, and kept working as if she hadn't heard anything, because that was exactly what she wanted him to believe. Cassius ended the call 5 minutes later, stepped out of the closed room, looked at her bending over the canvas, and said nothing more before sitting back down at the metal table, and she kept her breathing steady and her hand stable on the tool for the remaining 3 hours in the warehouse. A performance of control that 3 years with Dmitri had turned into second instinct. She left the warehouse at 6 o'clock in the evening as she did every day, said good evening in a normal voice, walked out the door normally, took the subway back to Bushwick normally, and when the studio door closed behind her and the bolt clicked into place, she stood in the middle of the room, breathing in long measured pulls until the anger stopped trembling in her ribs and began hardening into something more useful. Purpose. She opened her laptop. She took out her phone, opened the photograph of the 12-character sequence from the back of the painting, and she began doing the thing she was best at in the world after authenticating paintings, tracing origins backward. The Swiss account code was the starting point. She researched the code format to identify the bank and the decade in which the account had been opened. Then from there she contacted a fellow appraiser in Vienna whom she knew from a professional conference 2 years earlier, someone with access to the database of the Austrian Commission for the Protection of Artistic Heritage. She accessed the database of artworks stolen during World War II, the one every certified appraiser was authorized to use. She emailed an art historian at Columbia University, whom she knew had spent 20 years studying networks of stolen art trafficking in Eastern Europe after World War II, and she asked him very specifically about transport routes from Vienna to New York during the 1950s and 1960s, without telling him why she was asking. 5 days, 5 nights. Sloane lived inside the studio with her laptop open 20 hours a day. Printed documents spread across the floor like a map of something whose full shape she couldn't yet see, but that was slowly appearing piece by piece. Cold coffee cups on every flat surface. Her eyes red from lack of sleep, but bright with the thing she was finding, growing clearer each time a new piece fit into an empty space. By day, she still went to the warehouse, still worked in front of Cassius with a face that revealed nothing, still ate the food he placed beside her at 7 o'clock in the evening, still said good evening when she left, and every night she returned to the studio, opened her laptop, and kept digging deeper into the history of the stolen painting and the man who had called her a tool. Because if she was a tool, then she would be a tool that understood exactly who was holding her and why. And that knowledge would be the one thing no one, not Dmitri Kessler, not Cassius Rinaldi, not any man, could take from her hands. The final piece slipped into place at 2:47 in the morning on the 5th day, when the art historian at Columbia replied to her email with a 32-page attachment that he called Quick Notes, because for people who had spent 20 years studying a subject, 32 pages counted as quick notes. And Sloane opened that file on the floor of her Bushwick studio, amid the documents, spread out like spent fireworks after a festival, and began to read. And within 14 minutes, she had the name, the date, the address, the route, everything. Portrait of a Lady in Winter had belonged to the Engel family in Vienna, an affluent Jewish family that owned a small but valuable art collection, and the painting had been seized in 1943, along with the family's entire estate, during the confiscation of Jewish property. A chapter history had documented carefully, but had never finished returning. After the war, the painting didn't go back to Vienna. It disappeared into what the Columbia historian called the underground current, a network of stolen art trafficking that connected Eastern Europe to private collectors in the West, and that current had many branches, but one of its main branches ran through New York, and from the 1960s onward, the New York branch was operated by a family the historian described as having a complicated relationship with both the legitimate art world and organized crime. The Rinaldi family. Sloane read that name on her laptop screen at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning and felt it fall into the exact empty space in the puzzle she had been building for the past 5 days. Not with thunder, not with drama, just with the small click of the final thing landing where it belonged. The Swiss account code on the back of the painting belonged to Cassius Rinaldi's grandfather, who had bought the painting from the black market network after the war and hidden the account code somewhere only the owner of the painting could find it, a safe made of canvas and oil paint. Cassius hadn't hired her to authenticate the painting because he wanted to know whether it was real or fake. He had hired her because he needed an expert to confirm the painting's legitimacy, so it could be sold at public auction, its origins washed clean. And once the painting was sold legally, the Swiss account code would be legitimized with it. She was a tool, exactly as he had said over the phone. But Sloane didn't stop there, because her colleague in Vienna had sent her temporary access to the database of art transactions with disputed origins, and she had spent the last 2 of those 5 days searching for any connection between the Rinaldi network and transactions she had once authenticated in the past, because a question had begun forming in her mind on the 3rd night and had grown larger until she could no longer sleep. The question was this: how had Dmitri Kessler known her? Why had Dmitri Kessler chosen her? Why had a half-Russian, half-American investment fund manager appeared in the life of a 23-year-old art appraiser 4 years earlier and decided to marry her? The answer was on page 21 of the Columbia historian's file, in an appendix table listing suspected art transactions used for money laundering through the Rinaldi network during the past decade. Dmitri Kessler's name appeared in 2 transactions from long before they had ever crossed paths, well prior to the time he invited her for coffee at a small cafe near Columbia University, where she was finishing her advanced appraisal certification, back before he looked at her with eyes she thought were loving, and told her she was the most interesting person he had ever met. Beside Dimitri's name in the transaction file was a margin note, handwritten in blue ink. Kessler proposed approaching appraiser Davenport. Personal relationship. 7 words. Sloane read those 7 words, and read them again, and read them again. And each time she read them, they didn't change. They still said the same thing, that Dmitri Kessler had known about the underground art trafficking network before he had known about her, that he had approached her not because she was interesting or beautiful, or for any reason she had told herself over the past 4 years, but because she was a young, capable appraiser, easy to control, and her expertise was necessary to legitimize the transactions where dirty money went in and clean paintings came out. Her marriage was the most perfect fake painting she had ever failed to authenticate. She sat on the studio floor at 3 o'clock in the morning, her back against the bed frame, her laptop open on her thighs, documents scattered across the floor like evidence at a crime scene, and she felt something inside her, something she had kept intact for the past 10 months since leaving Dmitri through sheer will and a refusal to look at it too closely, finally break. It didn't break loudly. It didn't break in a violent, desperate way, with crying or screaming, or any reaction movies think women should have when they discover they have been betrayed down to the bone. It broke quietly, like when you hold a dry branch in your hands and snap it in half, and the sound is only a small crack. Then silence, and the 2 pieces lie in your hands, and you know there is no glue in the world that can put them back together, because it didn't break, because it was weak. It broke because it was dry, because it had been dead for a long time, and you hadn't known. She didn't break because of pain. She broke because of the final truth, because she knew now that she hadn't been the victim of failed love. She had been the product of a business project, and the man she had shared a bed with for 3 years had never looked at her and seen a human being. He had looked at her and seen an appraiser's certification, connections to the art world, and the ability to sign her name confirming authentic on the things he needed someone to sign. And the most painful part of all wasn't being used. The most painful part was knowing that she had loved a fake painting for 3 years. And her expert eyes, the eyes she trusted more than anything else in the world, the eyes that could tell 18th century oil paint from a modern copy at a distance of 1 meter, those eyes had looked straight at the closest and most perfect fake painting of her life every day for 3 years and hadn't recognized it. She didn't sleep after that. She sat on the studio floor until the first light of morning slipped through the kitchen window and turned the pile of documents on the floor from evidence into a decision. Because somewhere between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning, Sloane had shifted from a woman who had just discovered the truth into a woman who knew exactly what she was going to do with it. She showered, got dressed, drank coffee standing at the sink, arranged every document into a large envelope in chronological order from 1943 to the present, and took the subway to Tribeca at 8:15. 45 minutes earlier than the time she usually arrived. Cassius was already inside the warehouse, sitting at the metal table with an espresso and a file, his black shirt sleeves rolled up as they were every day, and he looked up when she came in earlier than usual, with the gaze of a man who registered the irregularity without commenting on it. Sloane walked straight to his table, didn't stop at her own workstation, didn't take off her coat, didn't set down her bag, and she placed the envelope of documents on the metal table directly in front of him, then opened it and spread out each page one by one in the order she had arranged. And as she laid them out, she spoke in a voice flat and clear in the way she had practiced all night. Not because she needed practice, but because she needed to be sure that when she spoke, not one note would shake. The painting was confiscated from the Engel family in Vienna in 1943. After the war, it passed through an underground art trafficking network connecting Eastern Europe to New York. From the 1960s onward, that network was operated by the Rinaldi family. The Swiss account code on the back of the painting belonged to your grandfather, and Dmitri Kessler appears in the transaction records from 4 years ago, 1 year before he married me, with a note proposing that I be approached because of my appraisal expertise. She set the final page down. My marriage was a cover for an art-based money laundering chain, and you want me to certify this painting as legitimate so it can be sold at auction and its origins washed clean. Cassius looked at the documents spread across the table. Then he looked at her, and Sloane waited for the reaction she had spent all night preparing herself to face. Waited for denial or anger or the subtle kind of threat Dmitri favored, or any variation of the response powerful men usually had when a woman placed evidence in front of them and told them to their faces that she knew. He didn't deny it. He didn't get angry. He didn't threaten her. He looked at her with that complete, unhurried gaze she had grown used to and said, "You're better than I thought." Not praise. A conclusion. The way he said everything, without ornament, without cushioning, just the truth stated in the fewest words possible. Sloane didn't stop to feel anything about that sentence because she wasn't finished. I want to return the painting to the Engel family. The silence stretched for 3 breaths. Then Cassius Rinaldi stood up. It was the first time he had stood because of her in the entire time she had known him, and the act changed the geometry of the room at once, because when Cassius Rinaldi was seated, he was a client, but when he stood, he became something else. Something, his height and the breadth of his shoulders, and the way he occupied space, communicated without a single word, the physical presence of power being challenged, and choosing to respond by reminding her that it existed. He stepped around the table, and the distance between them narrowed from 1.5 meters to less than 1 meter. And Sloane didn't step back, because she had lived with Dmitri Kessler for 3 years, and if she had retreated every time a taller man moved closer, she would have backed herself into the wall long ago. "That painting is worth $30 million, he said, his voice not changing in volume but changing in density. Heavier, thicker, the voice of a man weighing each word on a scale with money on one side and something he wasn't used to weighing on the other. "The Swiss account is worth 3 times that. You're asking me to give up $120 million because of morality." Sloane kept her eyes on his. "I'm asking you not to sell something stolen from people who were murdered." The sentence fell into the space between them and lay there, and no one picked it up, and no one stepped over it, and the warehouse was silent, except for the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of the city beyond the concrete walls. Cassius looked at her. Not the assessing look she had grown familiar with. This look was different, something moving behind the controlled surface of his face, something she couldn't read because it didn't belong to any dictionary of expression she had built for him over the past 2 weeks. "I'll think about it," he said. Then he turned back to the table, sat down, opened the file he had been reading before she arrived, and the conversation was over. Not yes, not no. "I'll think about it." And Sloane knew enough about powerful men to understand that "I'll think about it" from Cassius Rinaldi's mouth was a delay, a way of buying time while he ran the calculation she had just thrown into his equation, a calculation that, for the first time, contained a variable he wasn't used to handling. She picked up her coat, picked up her bag, walked to her workstation, and began to work, because the appraisal contract wasn't finished, and she was someone who completed what she started no matter what was burning around her. And she worked through that entire day with the painting stolen from a murdered family hanging in front of her and the man who owned it sitting 4 meters away. And no one said another word until she said good evening at 6 o'clock and walked out the door. A week passed without an answer. Cassius came to the warehouse, sat at the metal table, worked, took phone calls, and didn't mention the conversation about the painting or the Engel family or the $120 million again, as if that morning had never happened. And Sloane worked at her table, finished the official appraisal report, and didn't mention it again either, because she had said what she needed to say and the ball was now in his court. On Thursday evening, she left the warehouse at 6 o'clock as usual, took the subway back to Bushwick, climbed 4 flights of stairs, pulled out her key, and when she turned the lock, she realized it wasn't locked. She always locked the door. She locked doors the way other people breathed, automatically, without thinking, because 3 years with Dimitri had turned locking a door into a survival reflex, and her door being unlocked meant someone had opened it from the inside, or someone had a key she hadn't given them. She pushed the door open. The man was sitting in the only chair in the studio, the old wooden chair she had bought at a second-hand market on DeKalb Avenue, and he was drinking tea from her white ceramic mug, the mug Darcy had given her for her birthday last year with the words, "Still Alive" printed on it, which had made them both laugh when they bought it, because it was both a joke and not a joke at all. He was 58 years old, with shoulders as wide as a doorframe, short silver hair cut in a military style, hands around the teacup like 2 shovels wrapped in human skin, and he watched Sloane step into her own apartment with the total ease of a man sitting in his own living room, Gregor Volkov. She had never met him, but she knew the name from her research files. Dimitri's maternal uncle, the Brighton Beach Bratva branch, and his presence in her small studio with its low ceiling and portable oil heater was like stuffing a bear into a shoebox, everything in the room shrinking beneath his physical size. He didn't stand, didn't introduce himself. He only took a sip of tea from her cup, looked at her standing in the doorway with the key still in her hand, and spoke in English with a Russian accent so thick every vowel seemed flattened under pressure. "Niece, Dimitri has spoken a lot about you. I won't stay long. I came only to say this once." He took another sip of tea. "Sign the papers. Give Dimitri what he wants. Forget the marriage. Move on. You're young." He lowered the cup to his thigh. "I'm not a man who makes threats. I'm only saying that accidents happen. In a city this large, accidents happen every day. Buses, stairs, old gas stoves in old buildings like this one." He looked around the studio with the assessing eye of someone who had worked with fire before. Then he stood, and the act of him standing changed every proportion in the room again, and he walked to the kitchen sink, placed the teacup carefully in the basin as if it belonged to him, turned on the faucet, and rinsed it once, turned the water off, wiped his hands on the towel hanging from the bar beside the sink, and that politeness was colder than any threat, because it said he was so comfortable in her home that he washed the cup before leaving. He passed her in the doorway, paused just long enough for her to smell Russian tobacco and wet wool and something else she didn't want to name, then went down the stairs, his heavy footsteps sounding on each step until the lobby door on the ground floor slammed shut. Sloane closed the studio door, locked it, slid the bolt into place, stood with her back against the door, breathed. She looked at the chair where he had sat, looked at the sink where he had placed the cup, looked at the hand towel he had used, and now everything in her studio carried the fingerprints of what had just happened, and she would have to live inside this space tonight, knowing he had been able to enter whenever he wanted. She took out her phone. Her finger moved through her contacts and stopped on 2 names, Cassius Rinaldi and Ruth Adler. She chose Ruth, a lawyer, not a mafia boss, because if she called Cassius, she would be accepting that the solution to violence was greater violence, and she had lived inside that equation for 3 years already, and it never led anywhere except to the next circle. Ruth Adler answered on the 3rd ring and arrived at the studio within 1 hour, 52 years old, with short hair, a long coat still carrying the scent of a law office, and she sat in the chair Volkov had just occupied without knowing it, and listened to Sloane tell everything from beginning to end, with the still concentration of someone who had heard similar stories hundreds of times in her career, but still listened as if this were the first. When Sloane finished, Ruth was silent. Not the silence of someone processing information, but the silence of someone deciding whether to say something she had never said to any client before. Then she said, 20 years ago, my husband put his hands around my neck because I filed for divorce. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't dramatic. Flat, precise, the voice of someone who had told herself this story enough times to drain the emotion out of it and leave only the facts. The stretch between that night and the next morning was the longest stretch of my life. I didn't know whether I was going to live or die, and I didn't know which was worse. She looked at Sloane. "You're in that stretch right now. The law can protect you. I'll protect you with every legal tool I have. But not tonight. Tonight you need to be somewhere he doesn't know the address." Sloane called Darcy. 40 minutes later, she was sitting in Darcy's car as it crossed the Williamsburg Bridge toward Astoria, a backpack on her lap holding her laptop, the external hard drive containing the entire provenance file on the painting, her phone charger, and nothing else, because she had learned long ago how to pack her life into one backpack in 10 minutes. She didn't call Cassius. That decision was deliberate, and she knew exactly why. Because she didn't want to owe another man anything, and because she could still hear those 6 Italian words echoing in her mind through the half-open door. She is a tool, nothing more. Sloane arrived at the Tribeca warehouse at 9 o'clock the next morning from Astoria instead of Bushwick, and that difference in the subway line she had taken was the only physical evidence of the night before, besides the dark circles beneath her eyes and the backpack on her shoulder, which she had brought with her because she didn't dare leave it at Darcy's apartment in case she needed to run again. She pushed open the warehouse door and knew at once that Cassius already knew. He wasn't sitting at the metal table as he did every day. He was standing, in the center of the open space, his arms resting at his sides, his face turned toward the entrance, and that posture told her he had been standing there waiting for her, not just rising when he heard her footsteps, but already in place, because he knew she would come and he knew what conversation was waiting ahead. "Volkov was in your home last night," he said. Not a question. His voice was flat, presenting a fact, the way he said everything, and it was that flatness that made the cold begin spreading through Sloane's chest, because it meant he wasn't surprised, he wasn't reacting to new information, he was stating something he already knew, and if he already knew, then the question wasn't how he knew, but why he hadn't stopped it. "And you did nothing," she said. Cassius looked at her. "I let it happen. I needed to know how far Dmitri was willing to go. Whether he was only using lawyers and financial pressure, or whether he was willing to send Volkov." He said it in the voice of someone explaining strategy to a business partner, rational, structured, measuring risk and gathering data, and Sloane felt the cold move from her chest down into her stomach, and then into her legs, because she understood now, fully and clearly, that last night, when she had opened the studio door and seen Gregor Volkov sitting there drinking tea from her birthday mug, when she had stood in the doorway smelling Russian tobacco and hearing him talk about accidents happening every day in a big city, when she had called Ruth Adler and fled to Astoria with a backpack on her back, all that time Cassius Rinaldi had known it was happening and had chosen not to stop it, because her fear had been more valuable as gathered information than her safety. What if he didn't only come to talk? Sloane heard her own voice and realized it wasn't shaking. It was hard. Hard in the way metal is hard when frozen, brittle and sharp and able to cut. What if he put his hands on my throat? What if he hit me? "Sawyer was in the stairwell below your studio. 8 seconds. 8 seconds. He said 8 seconds as if it were an acceptable number, as if 8 seconds were a unit of safety in an equation where she was the variable, and the output was intelligence on how dangerous Dmitri Kessler had become. "Do you know someone can be killed in 8 seconds? She said. And it wasn't rhetorical. It was mathematics. Because Sloane had learned survival math from 3 years of living with Dmitri, and she knew exactly how many seconds it took for a hand strong enough to do enough damage. She knew because she had counted. She had counted seconds in the dark on the bathroom floor, waiting for Dmitri to fall asleep so she could get up without making a sound. And 8 seconds was an entire lifetime in that calculation. Cassius said nothing. Sloane picked up the backpack from the floor where she had just set it down, slung it over her shoulder. "I'll return the exhibition money. Cancel the appraisal contract. Find someone else." She walked toward the door. Every step across the polished concrete floor echoed through the empty warehouse, and she counted them. 4, 5, 6, 7 more steps to the door, and she would pass through it, and wouldn't turn back, and Cassius Rinaldi would become one more man on the list of men who had used her, and then been left behind by her. Sloane. She stopped. Not because he called out, because he called her by her name. Not Miss Davenport, as he had for the past 2 weeks. Sloane, for the first time, 2 syllables spoken in a voice she had never heard from him. Not flat, not the voice of command, but the voice of a man who had just realized he was losing something and, for the first time, wasn't sure he wanted to lose it. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "You're right," he said. I have no justification you should accept. Silence. Not calculating silence, the kind she had learned to classify over the past 2 weeks, but the silence of someone searching for words for something he wasn't used to expressing. But the painting. Another pause. I won't decide anything about it until you tell me what I should do with it. I've never had to decide anything based on right or wrong. I make decisions based on profit and risk. That's the only equation I know how to run. A final silence, the longest one. You're the first person who has asked a question that equation can't answer. Sloane turned around. Slowly, not because she had forgiven him or because she had decided to stay, but because she needed to look at his face when he said that, because 3 years with Dimitri had taught her that words were only half as trustworthy as the expression that came with them, and she needed to read his face to know whether this was real or only a more sophisticated version of manipulation. She looked, and she saw something she had never seen before on Cassius Rinaldi's face. Not the cold calculation she was used to, not the control he wore like armor, but something beneath all those layers, something that looked like the face of a 37-year-old man standing for the first time before a question that every equation he had ever built, every system he had ever operated, every rule of the world he had been born into and raised inside, could not answer. She said nothing. She hadn't decided, but she set the backpack down on the floor, and in the language the two of them had begun speaking to each other without either of them admitting it. That was enough for now. Ruth Adler called at 7:15 in the morning, and Sloane knew something was wrong, because Ruth never called before 8, unless what she needed to say couldn't wait another 45 minutes. Sloane was at Darcy's apartment in Astoria, sitting on the sofa with coffee in her hand, and Ruth's voice over the phone carried the quality of professional control. Sloane had learned to read over the 10 months of working with her, the kind of voice Ruth used when bad news was large enough to need careful packaging before delivery. You need to hear this from me before you see it anywhere else, Ruth said. Dimitri has filed a formal complaint with the American Association of Art Appraisers. He included a set of photographs of you going in and out of the warehouse in Tribeca over the past 3 weeks. He's accusing you of colluding with an organized crime syndicate to legitimize stolen artwork. Sloane set the coffee cup down on the table, because her hand suddenly wasn't trustworthy enough to hold anything. The American Association of Art Appraisers was the body that issued and revoked professional certification, and professional certification was the only thing that separated her from anyone with an opinion about paintings. It was the driver's license of her profession. Without it, she couldn't sign any appraisal report that a client, or auction house, or museum, or insurance company would accept, and losing it wouldn't mean losing work temporarily. It would mean losing her career permanently. Ruth continued. The complaint includes clearly time-stamped photographs. You entering the warehouse. You leaving the warehouse. Every day for 3 weeks. Someone was following you from close enough to capture the street sign number and the building number in the same frame as your face. Dimitri had hired someone to follow her. Not this week. From the first week she had started going to the warehouse, 3 weeks of photographs meant he had begun gathering evidence before she knew the painting was real, before she found the Swiss account code, before she still thought this was only an appraisal contract. He had been playing the long game while she was still learning what the board looked like. Is there anything else? Sloane asked. Because she knew there was. Because Dimitri never struck once when he could strike twice. He contacted Bennett Ashford, Ruth said. And that name made Sloane's stomach tighten because Bennett Ashford was the owner of the largest private auction house in the Northeast, the man Cassius intended to sell the painting through, and also the man who could become the biggest client of her career if she proved her ability through this contract. Dimitri informed Ashford that the painting scheduled for auction had disputed provenance, and that the appraiser in charge was under investigation by the association. Ashford froze the auction this morning. Sloane sat on the sofa in Darcy's Astoria apartment and looked out the window, watching the Queen's morning wake up with the sound of buses and storefront shutters being pulled open, and she thought about 10 months. 10 months since she had left Dimitri with 1 suitcase and a scar on her knuckle. 10 months of rebuilding from $3,400 in a studio with no central heat. 10 months to stand firmly enough to hold a comeback exhibition, to begin taking contracts again, to show the New York art world that Sloane Davenport still existed and was still good. And Dimitri was burning it all down again. Not with his hands, not with her wrist twisted at 2 o'clock in the morning, but with paperwork and photographs and phone calls, with the system, with the kind of weapon she couldn't raise her hands to block because it didn't strike her body. It struck her career, her reputation, The one thing she had spent 10 months rebuilding from the ashes. By the same person. The same person she had married because she thought he loved her. The same person she had separated from because he twisted her wrist. The same person she had discovered had married her because of her appraiser's certification. And now that same person was using that very certification as the target to make sure that even if she left him, he still held the power to destroy her whenever he wanted. "Ruth," Sloane said, and her voice was flat in the way she knew well. Flat not because she was calm, but because everything beneath the surface was moving too fast for the surface to keep up. "I need to know the timeline. How long does the association take to open a formal investigation?" 2 to 4 weeks after receiving the complaint. "And if they open an investigation, how long until they reach a conclusion?" 6 months to a year. "During that time, your certification is temporarily suspended." Temporarily suspended. It sounded like an administrative procedure. It felt like a professional death sentence written in polite language. Sloane didn't cry. She didn't call Darcy to unload. She didn't sit on the floor hugging her knees the way she had in the first months after leaving Dimitri. She ended the call with Ruth, set the phone down on the kitchen table in Darcy's apartment, sat perfectly still for exactly 90 seconds to let the shock run its full course from her chest down into her legs and dissolve, and after those 90 seconds, she opened her laptop. Because Sloane Davenport had spent 3 years reacting to Dimitri Kessler, and 10 months recovering from Dimitri Kessler, and she was tired down to the bone, of reacting. What she needed now wasn't reaction, it was action. And the difference between the two was the difference between being hit and hitting back. She opened the provenance file on the painting that she had built over 5 days and nights on the floor of her Bushwick studio, scrolled down to the section on the Engel family in Vienna, and began searching. If the painting had been confiscated from the Engel family in 1943, then that family had descendants, and those descendants had names, addresses, lives, and 80 years later, they still had a legal right to the property that had been stolen. She contacted the fellow appraiser in Vienna, who had helped her access the database before, and asked her to search for post-Holocaust property compensation records related to the Engel family. She contacted the Austrian Commission for the Protection of Artistic Heritage to ask about art restitution claims from Engel descendants. She emailed the historian at Columbia and asked whether he had any references to branches of the Engel family that had survived the war. 3 days. 3 days of phone calls, emails, waiting for replies, calling again, asking further, following each thread until the threads began leading back to the same place. On the 3rd day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon New York time, 10 o'clock at night Vienna time, Sloane found the name Hannah Engel Roth, 72 years old, granddaughter of the original owner of the painting, living in the 4th district of Vienna, a retired piano teacher, and Sloane had her email address from an organization supporting restitution for Holocaust victims' property, where Hannah had registered 20 years earlier, but had never received anything back. Sloane wrote the email, rewrote it again, because she didn't know the right way to tell a 72-year-old woman that the last painting of her grandparents, the painting her whole family had believed disappeared in the fire of war 80 years earlier, was hanging on the wall of a Tribeca warehouse owned by an Italian mafia boss, and a 27-year-old art appraiser was trying to return it to her. Mrs. Hannah replied within 3 hours. They had a video call the next morning. Hannah Engel Roth appeared on the laptop screen in Darcy's apartment in Astoria, silver-haired, with a small face and bright eyes behind round-framed glasses, and behind her was a little living room with an upright piano taking up half the space and framed family photographs on the wall. Sloane told her everything. Nothing held back, nothing added, no managing the information. The painting, the Rinaldi family, the black market network, the Swiss account code, all of it. And when Sloane reached the line, Portrait of a Lady in Winter, confiscated from the Engel family, Vienna, 1943, Mrs. Hannah lifted a hand to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears, and she said in English with a soft Austrian accent, "My grandmother's painting. 80 years. My mother died without knowing where it was." Sloane sat at Darcy's kitchen table, watching a 72-year-old woman cry on a screen because of a painting her grandparents had bought out of love for art before the war took everything from them, including their lives, and she knew she was doing the right thing. Not right in some abstract moral sense, right in the bones, the kind of right she felt in her chest, the way she felt a real painting beneath ultraviolet light, something solid that no layer of varnish could hide. With Mrs. Hannah's consent, Sloane recorded the entire conversation. Then she sat down and built the thing she was best at after authenticating paintings: a file. A rebuttal file to send to the American Association of Art Appraisers, in which she did not deny working at the Tribeca warehouse, did not deny appraising the painting for Cassius Rinaldi. She confirmed all of it. And then she presented the thing Dimitri never expected her to do. She had discovered on her own that the painting had been stolen, traced its provenance on her own, found the victim's descendant on her own, and contacted Hannah Engel Roth on her own to begin the restitution process. She included the full provenance evidence, included written confirmation from the art historian at Columbia, included the video of her conversation with Mrs. Hannah. She wasn't an accomplice. She was the person who found it. She sent the file to the association, sent a copy to Bennett Ashford with a short letter. "This is the truth. I'll let you judge it for yourself." And she sent a copy to Cassius Rinaldi with no letter, no note, nothing at all, only the file, because everything she needed to say to him was already inside those pages. Cassius Rinaldi sat at the metal table in the Tribeca warehouse and read Sloane's rebuttal file from the first page to the last without looking up once. And the reading took 2 hours, 2 hours in which he didn't answer the phone, didn't read any other file, didn't drink coffee, only sat with the stack of documents in front of him and turned each page with the kind of attention Sloane had come to recognize as the way he treated anything he considered important, with absolute silence and undivided focus. She wasn't in the warehouse while he read. She knew this because Francesca told her later, and Francesca's appearance at the warehouse was an event that said a great deal all by itself, because in all the time Sloane had worked in Tribeca, she had never once seen Francesca there. Francesca belonged to the penthouse on the Upper East Side, where she ran everything with a nod and a silence full of meaning, and the fact that she appeared at the warehouse meant she knew something important was happening and needed to be there when it did. Francesca stood beside Cassius's table, reading the file over his shoulder, and when he turned to the final page, Francesca said in the voice of someone who had served the Rinaldi family for 35 years and had kept the books for every transaction the family had ever made, including the ones no one wanted written down. "He knew where the painting came from. Your grandfather knew. I kept the books for 35 years. I know every transaction." She looked down at the file. "This girl doesn't stay silent. And she's right." Cassius didn't look at Francesca. He looked at the painting hanging on the opposite wall. Portrait of a Lady in Winter, the specialized light still falling on it as it did every day. The woman in the winter fur cloak, still looking out from the canvas, with eyes someone had painted 80 years earlier. And someone had stolen from the Engel family. And someone had hidden a Swiss account code behind. And someone had hung on the wall of this warehouse, waiting for an appraiser to sign her name and certify it as legitimate. And now that appraiser had signed her name to certify that it was stolen, and had sent the file to everyone she believed needed to know. Cassius picked up the phone. He called the Rinaldi family lawyer, and Sloane knew the contents of that call because Cassius told her later in the flat, precise voice he used when presenting a decision already made, not a decision still being discussed. Instructions to prepare the repatriation process for Portrait of a Lady in Winter to the Engel family. Contact the legal representative of Mrs. Hannah Engel Roth in Vienna. Close the Swiss bank account whose code was written on the back of the painting, and transfer the entire balance in that account to the Engel family, all of it, with no conditions. The second call that same day went somewhere entirely different. Through the federal lawyer, the Rinaldi family kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation. Cassius provided the FBI with records of Bratva money laundering transactions on territory he controlled, detailed records of every art transaction Dmitry Kessler and Gregor Volkov had run through the Rinaldi network over the past 5 years. Every stream of dirty money going in, every clean painting coming out, every name and date and amount Francesca had meticulously recorded during 35 years of bookkeeping. In exchange, a federal cooperation agreement, immunity from prosecution for Cassius, and the direct operations of the Rinaldi family, along with a commitment to restructure the businesses on a 2-year timeline. He was burning the bridge to the Bratva and using the ashes to build something else, and Sloane was the one who had struck the match, though she didn't know the fire had begun to burn. That evening, Sloane had returned to her Bushwick studio because she couldn't live in Darcy's apartment forever, and because Ruth had filed for an emergency protective order in court the previous morning, and because Sloane refused to let fear decide where she slept. She was standing at the kitchen window, at nearly 9 o'clock at night, looking down at the street, when she saw Dmitri. He was standing below, under the yellow streetlight, alone. No Volkov, no men, no driver waiting in a car. Just Dmitri Kessler, standing on the sidewalk, looking up at her building with a face she had never seen on him in all 4 years she had known him. A face without a mask, without sharp cheekbones arranged into charm, without a smile designed to create trust. Only the real face of a 35-year-old man who looked tired and angry and afraid. Sloane picked up her phone, and this time she called Cassius. Not because she had no other choice, but because she chose to call him. That difference mattered more than anything else that had happened so far. Cassius arrived in 20 minutes, through the back stairs of the building, and when Dmitri rang the downstairs lobby bell, Sloane opened the studio door just as Cassius stood at the far end of the hallway behind her, and Dmitri climbed 4 flights of stairs, and stood in front of her door, and saw Cassius Rinaldi standing behind her in the hallway light, and Dmitri's unmasked face received that information like a punch to the stomach. Cassius spoke Russian, slowly, word by word, loud enough for Dmitri to hear every syllable clearly. Volkov left New York this morning. Bratva accounts at 3 banks have been frozen. I didn't do it. He looked at Sloane, then back at Dmitri. The FBI did, based on the records she traced. Silence filled the narrow hallway on the 4th floor of the walk-up building in Bushwick. Dmitri looked at Sloane, and she looked back, and she saw the exact moment he understood. The moment every piece fell into place in his head and he realized that the girl he had married for her appraiser's certification, the girl he had spent 3 years turning into a money laundering tool, the girl whose wrist he had twisted and whose meals he had controlled and whom he had called emotionally unstable, that girl had just used the exact expertise he had married her to obtain to destroy his family's entire financial network. Dmitri said nothing. He turned around, walked down the stairs. His footsteps sounded on each step, slower and slower. Then the lobby door on the ground floor opened and closed, and the November rain in Brooklyn swallowed the last sound of Dmitri Kessler walking out of her life. No violence, no final threat, no buttoning of his coat, or any ritual of retreat. Just defeat. The ground floor lobby door closed behind Dmitri, and the sound echoed up 4 flights of stairs before fading out, and the hallway fell silent again except for the rain falling outside the window at the far end of the hall. That November rain in Brooklyn that wasn't romantic at all, cold and steady and wet and real. And Cassius Rinaldi stood at the end of the 4th floor hallway, looking at her across 4 meters of old wooden floor, and Sloane stood in the doorway of her studio looking back. And between them, there was nothing but air, and the thing they both knew was there but neither of them had named yet. You gave the files to the FBI, she said, and it wasn't a question because she had heard him say it to Dmitri, but she needed to hear him say it again to her. Only to her, not as a weapon, but as the truth. Yes. What will you lose? Cassius tilted his head slightly, the smallest gesture. One she had learned to read over the past weeks as a sign that he was weighing how honest to be rather than weighing the answer, because Cassius always knew the answer. He only decided whether or not to say it. Many things. Some operations will close. Some people will need to find other work. My lawyers will be busy for a few years. He said it in a flat voice, but not a cold one, the voice of a man taking inventory of damage he had inflicted on himself and looking straight at it instead of looking away. The Swiss account? Closed. The painting? On its way back to Vienna. Sloane breathed in. The painting was on its way back to Vienna. 9 words whose weight she wasn't sure she could fully measure, because that painting was worth $30 million, and the Swiss account held 3 times that. And Cassius Rinaldi had just given up $120 million. Not slowly, not reluctantly, but with a phone call to the family lawyer, while Francesca stood beside him and nodded. Why? She asked. And that question wasn't about money. It wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about the FBI or the Federal Cooperation Agreement. Why? And she needed him to understand that she was asking the real thing, the only thing she needed to hear from him now, before she decided anything else. Cassius was silent. Not the calculating silence she had learned to classify. The silence of someone trying to say something he had never put into words for anyone because he had never needed to say it before. Because I ran every equation I know, he said, slowly, word by word, his voice lower than usual. Profit, risk, legal consequences, opportunity cost. I ran all of it. And the only answer I found that I could say and still look at your face afterward." He stopped, was to return it. Rain had fallen on his shoulder. He had been standing at the end of the hallway near the open window, long enough for the right shoulder of his black shirt to soak through, and he either hadn't noticed or didn't care, and that small detail struck Sloane somewhere she hadn't prepared for, because this was a man who controlled everything, controlled an empire, controlled his expression, controlled every word he said, and here he was standing in the hallway outside her apartment, with a wet shoulder and no awareness of it. "Come inside," she said. "You're wet." Cassius Rinaldi stepped into Sloane Davenport's Bushwick studio, and the space had never felt smaller than it did then, the low ceiling nearly touching his head, the oil-filled heater ticking in the corner, the old wooden floorboards creaking beneath his steps, and everything in that studio. The single bed, the folding kitchen table, the sink where Volkov had washed his teacup, all of it small and cheap and real, and he stood in the middle of it, like a man who had just burned $120 million, standing in a room where the monthly rent was $1,400, and the heater ran on oil. She handed him the towel from the bar beside the sink, the same towel Volkov had used to wipe his hands a week earlier, and she had washed it 3 times since then. But the fact that she was giving it to Cassius now carried a symmetry she didn't want to analyze in that moment. He took the towel, dried his shoulder, folded it, set it on the kitchen table. Every movement was precise and economical, as everything he did always was, but tonight that precision didn't look like control. It looked like the habit of a man who didn't know what to do with his hands when he wasn't managing something. "I'm not a good man," he said. And he said it not as an apology or a warning, but as a fact. The way he said everything. Flat, direct, unadorned. "I know," Sloane said, because she did know. She had known from the night at the gallery. She had known when she heard him call her a tool in Italian. She had known when he admitted he had let Volkov into her home. She knew he wasn't a good man, and she didn't need him to be a good man, because she had already tried loving someone she thought was good, and the result was the scar on her right knuckle. "I don't know if I can become a good man," he said. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not softness, because Cassius Rinaldi wasn't soft, but something scraped raw, the voice of a man saying something for the first time, without knowing where it would land. "I don't know either," Sloane said, and she was surprised by how honest that sentence was. More honest than anything she had said to anyone in a very long time. "But you just gave $120 million back to a family your grandfather robbed 80 years ago. She looked at him. "That isn't good." "That's right. And sometimes, right is where things begin." The studio went quiet. The oil heater ticked. Rain moved outside the window. The distant city kept breathing. Brooklyn on a November night. Indifferent to everything happening on the 4th floor of a walk-up building in Bushwick. Sloane placed her hand over his where it rested on the kitchen table. Only placed it there. Didn't grip, didn't pull, didn't say anything more. And Cassius Rinaldi, the man who controlled an empire, the man who gave orders in a low voice and was obeyed without having to repeat himself, the man who had never let anyone touch whatever lived beneath the armor, turned his hand over, slowly, and their fingers threaded together. No drama, no vows, no kiss. Just hand in hand in a small Bushwick studio at 10 o'clock at night in the November rain. And that was all. And that was enough. The months that followed moved at a different speed. Not fast or slow, but real. The kind of speed real life takes on when it stops being pushed forward by crisis and begins moving by its own gravity. Dmitry Kessler was federally indicted in December, 3 weeks after the rainy night in Bushwick, and the 42-page indictment listed money laundering through art transactions, conspiracy to intimidate, violation of the protective order Ruth Adler had obtained 2 days after Volkov sat in Sloane's studio drinking tea, and Sloane read the indictment on the federal court website from her desk in the Tribeca warehouse, and didn't feel satisfied or relieved or any of the things she had thought she might feel. She only felt tired. Tired in a good way. The kind of tired that comes when someone finally sets down something heavy they have carried for too long. Dmitry received 7 years in federal prison through a plea agreement in February. His lawyer negotiated a sentence below the maximum range, and Sloane had no opinion about that because the length of Dmitry's sentence mattered less to her than the fact that there was now a permanent legal record stating exactly what he had done. Not the version he told, not the version she wondered on sleepless nights if she had exaggerated, but the truth confirmed by a court with a seal and a judge's signature. Gregor Volkov was arrested by the FBI in Brighton Beach that same month, in an apartment above a Russian smoked meat shop on Brighton 6th Street, and Sloane heard the news from Ruth over the phone and didn't ask for details because she didn't need details. She only needed to know that the man who had sat drinking tea from her birthday mug and talked about accidents happening every day in a big city wouldn't be sitting in anyone's home again for a very long time. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in March, not in court but through lawyer correspondence because Dmitry was in federal custody and wasn't present to sign in person, and Sloane received the original divorce papers from Ruth at the law office on Park Avenue South, brought them back to her Bushwick studio, sat at the folding kitchen table, and looked at her signature on the final page, alone, with no ritual, no celebratory wine, no Darcy, no one, just her and the paper and the reality that 3 years of her life had just been closed with 14 minutes of paperwork. She didn't cry. Not yet. Cassius restructured the Rinaldi empire according to the timeline he had committed to with the FBI, and the process was slow and painful and costly in the way only someone who has built something can understand the true cost of taking it apart, the illegal divisions gradually closing piece by piece, personnel reassigned or dismissed, legal operations expanded to absorb whatever could be converted, and Francesca kept the books for the transition, with the same meticulous care with which she had kept the books for the old empire, because Francesca served the family, not the business model. The painting was repatriated to Vienna in April. The small ceremony took place at the museum where the Engel family collection had once been displayed before the war, with only 12 people attending, and Sloane flew over for it because Mrs. Hannah had invited her, and because she needed to see the painting hanging where it belonged once before she could truly set it down. Hannah Engelroth held Sloane's hand in both of hers, her 72-year-old hands small and warm and trembling slightly, and she said, "You gave back to me what I thought was lost forever," and Sloane Davenport cried. For the first time in this entire story, since the night at the gallery, since hearing Cassius call her a tool, since Volkov in her studio, since discovering that her marriage was a fake painting, since reading the divorce papers at her kitchen table, she hadn't cried for any of those things, but she cried here, in the small museum in Vienna, because these weren't tears of pain, but tears for something she had done right, and that had reached its destination, truly reached it, the painting hanging on the wall where it belonged, and Mrs. Hannah holding her hand, and 80 years finally closing. The American Association of Art Appraisers cleared the accusations against Sloane in May, not only clearing them but citing her rebuttal file as a model example of professional ethics, and Bennett Ashford called her 1 week later, with the voice of a 64-year-old man doing something 64-year-old men rarely did. "Miss Davenport, I owe you an apology for freezing the auction without verifying the source, and I owe you an invitation. Head of appraisal at Ashford & Associates, if you're interested." Sloane accepted because work was the language she trusted, the one thing in her life that had never betrayed her, and this time, work wasn't something she did to hide or to survive or to prove herself to anyone. It was hers. Cassius and Sloane didn't move in together. She kept the Bushwick studio. He stayed in the Upper East Side penthouse. They saw each other at the Rhythm, chosen by two people who had been through enough to be together by choice, instead of being forced together by circumstance. Sometimes 3 evenings a week. Sometimes the whole week, sometimes a long weekend when she brought her laptop to the penthouse and worked while he sat reading files in the next room, and that parallel presence needed no words to function. One June evening, Sloane stood in the penthouse looking at the wall where Portrait of a Lady in Winter had once hung. Cassius hadn't hung anything in its place. The wall was empty, painted white, illuminated by the specialized lights still mounted on the track because no one had taken them down, museum light falling over absence. "Do you regret it?" she asked without turning around, because she knew he was standing behind her. She always knew where he was in a room, the same way she always knew every exit in a room, a survival reflex repurposed for something gentler. "Every day," he said, "and every day I know it was the right decision." Those two things exist at the same time. Sloane turned to look at him. The museum light fell over the empty space behind her, and Cassius's face was half lit and half shadowed in the reflected glow. And she thought that sentence was the most honest thing he had ever said, because it acknowledged both truths, without choosing the easier one. "That's probably the most honest thing you've ever said," she said. And he looked at her and said nothing more. And they stood before the empty wall in the Upper East Side penthouse, and that absence said more than any painting that had ever hung there. September. The Tribeca warehouse. The same raw concrete wall. The same 6-meter ceiling. The same industrial lights on metal tracks. But today there were white flowers in glass vases set on the metal table, where Cassius had once sat reading files, and hadn't stood to greet her the first time she walked in. And there were 8 chairs arranged in a half-circle before the wall where Portrait of a Lady in Winter had once hung. And Sloane Davenport stood in the small bathroom in the corner of the warehouse, looking at herself in the mirror and thinking about why she had chosen this place. Darcy had asked her 2 weeks earlier when Sloane told her the location, asking in the voice of an emergency nurse assessing whether a patient was alert. Why there? And Sloane had answered with the sentence she had thought about for a long time. Because I want to stand in the place where he once called me a tool, and turn it into the place where he calls me his wife. Darcy said nothing after that, and Darcy's silence was the highest form of approval Darcy Webb was capable of giving. 8 people. Darcy sat in the first chair on the left, her hair neatly tied back, wearing the navy dress she had bought in a hurry from Zara that morning because Darcy owned no dresses except hospital scrubs and jeans. And when Sloane stepped out of the bathroom in the sharp white women's suit she had chosen by herself, without asking anyone's opinion, because this was her wedding, and she would wear what she wanted, Darcy didn't cry. Darcy looked at her, nodded once, slow and deep, a nod that held 15 years of friendship and 3 years of watching Sloane be destroyed, and all the months of watching Sloane rebuild herself, and all the nights answering the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning, and all the times she had told Sloane straight to her face that Dimitri was an abuser. Before Sloane was ready to hear it, all of it held inside that nod. Then Darcy hugged her, short, tight, and that was enough. Francesca sat in the second chair, back straight, hands resting on her lap, her face wearing the expression Sloane had come to know over many months as her expression for every situation, except today, when Cassius walked into the warehouse in a black suit with no tie, like the first day, and stood before Sloane. Francesca did something Sawyer later swore he had never seen in all the time he had worked for the Rinaldi family. She smiled. Not a laugh, not a wide grin, just the right corner of her mouth lifting a few millimeters into something that on anyone else's face wouldn't have been worth mentioning, but on Francesca's face was the equivalent of fireworks. And Sawyer, standing behind her chair holding a glass of water for a guest, nearly dropped the glass because he turned back twice to make sure he hadn't mistaken it. Ruth Adler sat in the third chair, attending as a guest for the first time in her relationship with Sloane rather than as her lawyer, and Bennett Ashford sat in the fourth chair, 64 years old, in a 3-piece gray suit, formal despite the informal ceremony, because Bennett Ashford was formal everywhere, even when buying coffee. 3 other people from Cassius's organization, people Sloane had gradually come to know over the months, people whose names she knew, and whose coffee orders she knew, and whose loyalty to Cassius she had stopped judging because loyalty was more complicated than she had once believed. Cassius stood before her. The industrial light fell from above, casting shadows under his cheekbones, and making the scar at his left temple brighter than usual. And he looked at her, with the gaze she had known since the night at the gallery, the complete, unhurried gaze that she had traveled from finding frightening, to finding familiar, to finding necessary, to recognizing it as one of the essential conditions of her life that she didn't need to explain to anyone. The vows were short. Cassius spoke first. I don't promise perfection. I promise no varnish. 7 words, and each word carried the weight of a man who had lived 37 years behind the thickest coat of varnish that money and power could buy, and was standing before 8 people saying he would stop. Sloane said, I don't promise easy. I promise to stay long enough to see the original painting underneath. And as she said it, she understood that this wasn't a vow about marriage. It was a vow about restoration. The same kind of vow she had made to every painting she had ever restored. I will stay long enough, I will look closely enough, I won't give up when the varnish is thicker than I thought. After the ceremony, while 8 people stood in the warehouse with wine and light food that Francesca had arranged with the same efficiency with which she arranged everything, Sloane walked to the wall where Portrait of a Lady in Winter had once hung. The wall was still empty, the specialized light still shining down on the blank space. But now something hung there. A simply framed letter, a thin wooden frame, clear glass, and inside was a copy of a handwritten thank you letter from Mrs. Hannah Engelroth sent from Vienna, the slightly trembling handwriting of a 72-year-old woman on cream-colored stationery, and Sloane had framed it and hung it there that morning before anyone arrived. Because that wall needed to be filled with something more real than art. Cassius stood beside her, looking at the framed letter. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The letter said everything, and the empty space had been filled, not with a $30 million painting, but with one handwritten page from a 72-year-old piano teacher in Vienna saying thank you. She had come to authenticate a painting. She had stayed to find the original image beneath the varnish, of the painting, and of the man. Restoration isn't repair. Restoration is showing someone that the version of themselves that hasn't been hidden deserves to exist. And he, the man who had never allowed anyone to see the original painting beneath all the layers that power and cruelty and 37 years of living in the world his grandfather and father had built had placed over him, had trusted her. Not because she saved him, not because she changed him, but because she looked straight at every layer of varnish and said, "I see what's underneath, and it is worthy." The lesson this story wants to send you isn't about love saving everything, because love doesn't save everything. Sloane saved herself before she allowed anyone to step into her life again. The lesson is that you don't owe anyone because they saved you. You only owe yourself a life you choose with your eyes open. The lesson is that real respect isn't protecting someone from the truth, but believing they're strong enough to face it. And the lesson is that sometimes right isn't easy, isn't cheap, isn't comfortable. But living with the right decision is always easier than living with the wrong one, whether the price is $120 million or only the courage to tell a powerful person to their face that they're wrong. If this story has touched you in any way, please like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it today. Sometimes a story arriving at the right moment can change the way someone looks at their own life. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the new stories every day. Stories written to touch your heart and leave something worth keeping after you turn off the screen. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did this story bring up for you? Did it make you think of someone in your real life? Have you ever stood before a choice between easy and right? Share it in the comments below. We read every comment, and every story you share from deep in your heart is the inspiration that keeps us creating content worthy of the time you spend with us. Thank you for staying until the very last minute. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.